The first rays of sunlight painted the Arizona desert in shades of gold and orange. Mary Beth wiped her hands on her apron as she watched the morning light creep across the valley. Her small ranch sat like a tiny island in an ocean of endless wilderness. The nearest neighbor lived 20 miles away, and the closest town was a full day's ride through rough country. She had been awake since 4 in the morning. Same as every day. Ranch life didn't allow for sleeping in. Her husband Daniel was already out checking on their small herd of cattle. Their 2 children, 10-year-old Lucy and 8-year-old Ben, were still sleeping soundly in their beds. These quiet morning moments were precious to her. Soon the day would fill with endless chores, cooking, mending, and the 100 small tasks that kept their little family alive in this harsh land. Mary Beth stepped outside to gather eggs from the chicken coop. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of sage and desert flowers. She loved this place, despite its dangers. They had built something real here, something that belonged to them. Daniel always said they were living the American dream, carving out their own piece of paradise from the wild frontier. But paradise, she had learned, could disappear in the blink of an eye. The first sign of trouble was the absolute silence. The birds had stopped singing. Even the chickens seemed nervous, clucking softly and staying close to their coop. Mary Beth felt a chill run down her spine. In 3 years of frontier living, she had learned to trust these warning signs. Nature always knew when danger was coming. She dropped the egg basket and ran toward the house, calling out for Daniel. Her voice echoed across the empty valley, but there was no answer. Where was he? He should have been back by now. The cattle weren't that far from the house. Then she saw them. Dark figures moved, like shadows along the ridge above their ranch. They were still far away, but she could tell they were on horseback. Her heart began to pound. Daniel had always warned her about this possibility. Apache war parties sometimes raided the scattered ranches, looking for supplies, horses, or captives to trade. Mary Beth burst through the front door of their small wooden house. "Lucy, Ben, wake up right now!" She shouted, shaking her children from their sleep. "We need to hide in the root cellar, quickly." Lucy sat up, rubbing her eyes. "What's wrong, Mama?" "Just trust me, sweetheart. Grab your brother's hand and follow me." The root cellar was a small underground room where they stored vegetables and preserved food for winter. Daniel had dug it extra deep and reinforced the wooden door, joking that it could double as a storm shelter. Mary Beth had never imagined they might need it for protection from raiders. She pushed her children down the narrow wooden steps and followed behind them, pulling the heavy door closed. Above their heads, the cellar was dark and smelled of potatoes and dried corn. Ben started to cry softly, frightened by the sudden rush and his mother's obvious fear. "She, my brave boy," Mary Beth whispered, pulling both children close. "We're playing a hiding game. We have to be very quiet." Through the thin wooden door they could hear horses approaching, many horses. The sound grew louder and closer until it seemed like thunder rolling across their yard. Mary Beth's hands shook as she held her children tighter. The attack came with terrifying speed. War cries filled the air, followed by the sound of breaking glass and splintering wood. The raiders were tearing apart everything her family had built. She could hear their chickens squawking in panic and their cow bellowing in fear. Then came a sound that made her blood freeze. Daniel's voice shouting her name. He was back from checking the cattle, riding straight into the middle of the raid. She wanted to scream, to warn him, but she knew that would only put her children in danger. The shooting started moments later. First Daniel's rifle, then return fire from many weapons. The battle lasted only minutes, but it felt like hours. Mary Beth pressed her hands over her children's ears, trying to block out the horrible sounds. When the gunfire stopped, an eerie quiet settled over the ranch. Mary Beth waited, hardly daring to breathe. Were the raiders gone? Was Daniel alive? She couldn't hear his voice anymore. Footsteps moved around outside the cellar. Heavy boots walking slowly, searching. Someone was checking every building, looking for anything they might have missed. Mary Beth prayed the cellar door would hold, that whoever was up there wouldn't think to look for a hidden room. The footsteps stopped directly above them, through a small crack in the wooden door. Mary Beth could see a thin slice of the outside world. A pair of moccasined feet stood inches from the cellar entrance. The person above them wasn't moving, as if he sensed something was wrong. Her heart hammered so loudly she was sure he would hear it. Lucy and Ben had gone completely still, sensing their mother's terror. Even little Ben had stopped crying. The feet moved away, and Mary Beth allowed herself to breathe again. But her relief was short-lived. Minutes later, she smelled smoke. The raiders were burning their house. Through her small viewing crack, she watched flames consume everything her family owned. Their furniture, their clothes, Lucy's dolls, Ben's wooden toys, the family Bible that had belonged to Daniel's grandfather, all of it turned to ash and smoke. But where was Daniel? She hadn't seen him anywhere. Was he hiding somewhere else? Had he escaped? Or was he ... that she couldn't let herself think about that possibility. The smoke grew thicker, and Mary Beth realized they were in real danger. If the fire spread to the cellar door, they would be trapped. She made a decision that went against every instinct. She would have to look outside. Very carefully, she lifted the cellar door just enough to peek out. The sight that greeted her broke her heart into pieces. Their beautiful little house was completely destroyed. The barn was burning too. And there, lying motionless near the front porch, was Daniel. Mary Beth bit her lip to keep from crying out. Her husband, her partner, her best friend in the whole world, was gone. She was alone with two small children in the middle of dangerous wilderness, with no home, no supplies, and no way to get help. But something else caught her attention. One of the raiders stood apart from the others, watching the destruction with what looked like sadness rather than satisfaction. He was tall and lean, with long black hair decorated with eagle feathers. His face was painted with red and white designs that marked him as a war leader. What struck her most was his expression. While the other warriors celebrated their successful raid, this man looked troubled. He stared at Daniel's body for a long moment, then turned away as if the sight pained him. Mary Beth had heard stories about Apache culture from traders who passed through the area. She knew they valued courage and honor above all else. Perhaps this warrior respected Daniel for defending his family. Even though they had been enemies, the raiding party began to leave, loading their stolen supplies onto pack horses. Mary Beth counted 12 warriors in total. They moved with practiced efficiency, like men who had done this many times before. As they prepared to ride away, the tall warrior with the eagle feathers looked back toward the ranch one more time. His eyes seemed to search the area, as if he knew something had been left unfinished. Mary Beth held her breath, keeping perfectly still. If he discovered the cellar, she and her children would become captives. She had heard terrible stories about what happened to frontier families taken by raiding parties. Finally, the warrior turned his horse and rode away with the others. The sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance, leaving only the crackling of flames and the whisper of desert wind. Mary Beth waited until the sun was high overhead before she dared to emerge from the cellar with her children. What she found was the complete destruction of everything they had worked so hard to build, but they were alive. Against all odds, her family had survived. Now came the real challenge, figuring out how to stay alive in a hostile wilderness with no supplies and no help coming. She looked at her two frightened children and made a promise. Whatever it took, she would find a way to get them to safety. She had no idea that her path would soon cross again with the troubled Apache warrior who had spared their lives. The frontier had many more surprises in store for all of them. 3 days had passed since the raid, and Mary Beth felt like she was living in a nightmare that never ended. The Apache warriors had returned the morning after the attack and found her family hiding in the ruins of their ranch. There had been no escape, no clever plan that worked. Just the cold reality of being outnumbered and alone in the wilderness. Now she sat in the Apache camp, her hands tied loosely with leather strips, watching her captors go about their daily routines. The camp was nothing like she had imagined. These weren't the savage monsters from the stories she had heard in town. They were families, men, women, children, and elders, living together in a community that moved with the seasons. But Lucy and Ben were nowhere to be seen. Every time she asked about her children, the warriors would point toward the mountains and say words she couldn't understand. Her heart ached with worry. Were they safe? Were they being treated well? The not knowing was the worst torture of all. The tall warrior with the eagle feathers sat across the camp from her, cleaning his rifle with careful attention. She had learned his name was Nalnish, which one of the younger warriors had translated as he who listens. He seemed to be their leader, or at least someone the others respected greatly. What puzzled Mary Beth was how he kept looking at her. Not with cruelty or hatred, but with something that looked almost like curiosity. Sometimes she caught him watching her when he thought she wasn't paying attention. There was intelligence in his dark eyes and something else she couldn't quite identify. On the second day, she had tried to escape. It was a foolish plan, but desperation made people do foolish things. She had waited until most of the warriors were away hunting, then slipped her bonds and tried to run toward the mountains, where she believed her children were being held. She hadn't made it 50 yards before Nalnish appeared in front of her, seemingly out of nowhere. She expected anger, maybe even violence. Instead, he had simply shaken his head and walked her back to camp. No punishment, no harsh words. Just disappointment, as if he had expected better from her. That night he had done something completely unexpected. He brought her a blanket and a bowl of stew made from rabbit and wild plants. The gesture was small, but it meant everything to a woman who had been prepared to die. Why? She had asked him, looking into his weathered face. He didn't understand English, but somehow he seemed to understand her question. He pointed to himself, then to her, then made a gesture that could have meant family or protection. She wasn't sure which. Now, on the third morning, everything changed. Mary Beth woke to the sound of angry voices and horses approaching fast. A group of Apache warriors she hadn't seen before rode into camp, their faces painted for war. These men looked different from Nalnish's group, harder, more aggressive. Their leader was a stocky man with a scar running from his left eye to his jaw. The argument that followed was conducted entirely in Apache, but Mary Beth could tell it was about her. The scarred leader kept pointing in her direction and speaking in sharp, demanding tones. Nalnish responded calmly, but she could see tension building in his shoulders. An old Apache woman who spoke some English came and sat beside Mary Beth. Her name was Ayana, and she had been kind to Mary Beth since her capture. Bad trouble, Ayana whispered. That man is Bidsy. He leads different band. Says you belong to him now. Says Nalnish has gone soft. Mary Beth's blood turned cold. What does that mean? Bidsy's people, they hate white settlers more. They want to trade you to Comanche raiders for horses and guns. You never see children again? The argument was getting more heated. Other warriors from both groups had gathered in a circle, hands resting on their weapons. Mary Beth realized she was watching a conflict that could tear this community apart. Nalnish stood slowly, his hand moving to the knife at his belt. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. But Bidsy wasn't backing down. The scarred leader drew his own knife and stepped forward. Mary Beth couldn't watch her protector fight for her life while she sat helpless. Without thinking, she jumped to her feet and walked directly into the circle between the two men. Every warrior in the camp froze. Women didn't interfere in matters of war, especially not white captives. She could have been killed on the spot for such disrespect, but instead of anger, she saw surprise on their faces. Even Bidsy looked taken aback by her boldness. Mary Beth looked directly at Nalnish and spoke slowly, hoping he would understand her meaning if not her words. My children, she said, pointing toward the mountains. I help you. You help me find my children. Nalnish studied her face for a long moment. Then he turned to Bidsy and spoke rapidly in Apache. Whatever he said made the scarred leader laugh, but not in a friendly way, Ayana translated quietly. Nalnish says you are under his protection, says you have proven your courage. Bidsy says courage means nothing, says white woman brings bad luck to Apache people. The standoff continued for several more minutes, with warriors from both sides choosing sides. Mary Beth realized she had stumbled into something much bigger than just her own fate. This was about leadership, about different ways of dealing with the changing world around them. Finally, Bidsy spat in the dust and remounted his horse. He rode away with his followers, but not before making what was clearly a threat. The message was obvious. This wasn't over. When the dust settled, Nalnish approached Mary Beth. He looked tired, as if the confrontation had aged him several years. But when he spoke to Ayana, there was determination in his voice. He says, "Big trouble coming," the old woman translated. "Army soldiers looking for you. They think you dead, but they want revenge anyway. Bidsy will tell them where to find us." Mary Beth felt hope and terror at the same time. Rescue might be coming, but it would likely mean death for everyone in this camp, including potentially her children if they were nearby. "What can we do?" she asked. Nalnish seemed to understand her question without translation. He pointed to himself, then to her, then toward the mountains. He made a walking gesture with his fingers. Ayana's eyes widened. "He says only chance is to leave together. Find your children, then get far away before soldiers come. He knows secret paths through mountains that army cannot follow." Mary Beth stared at the Apache leader in amazement. "He would do that? Risk everything to help me?" The old woman spoke to Nalnish, then turned back to Mary Beth. "He says his own family was killed by white soldiers 3 summers ago. His wife? 2 sons? He understands what it means to lose children." For the first time since her capture, Mary Beth saw past the war paint and cultural differences to the man underneath. Nalnish wasn't just an Apache warrior, he was a father who had lost everything, just like she was a mother trying to save her family. "Tell him yes," she said firmly. "Tell him I'll do whatever it takes." Nalnish nodded once, then began giving orders to his people. Some would stay and try to mislead Bidsy and the soldiers. Others would scatter into the desert, taking different routes to safety, but he and Mary Beth would travel together into the most dangerous part of the wilderness, where 2 different worlds would have to trust each other completely or die trying. As the sun set on what might be their last peaceful evening, Mary Beth realized her life had changed forever. She was no longer just a frontier widow trying to survive. She had become part of something larger, something that challenged everything. She thought she knew about enemies and allies. The real journey was about to begin. The moon was just a thin slice in the star-filled sky when Nalnish woke Mary Beth from her restless sleep. He pressed a finger to his lips, signaling for complete silence. In the distance, she could hear the faint sound of horses approaching. Many horses. The army patrol had found their camp faster than anyone expected. Nalnish had prepared for this moment. He handed Mary Beth a bundle of Apache clothing, a leather dress, moccasins, and a woven blanket to cover her light brown hair. She quickly changed behind a large boulder while he gathered supplies and weapons. When she emerged, she looked like an Apache woman from a distance. The transformation was remarkable, but she felt strange wearing the clothes of people she had been taught to fear just days ago. Now these same clothes might save her life. They slipped away from the camp like shadows, moving through terrain that would have been impossible to navigate in daylight. Nalnish knew every rock, every hidden path, every safe place to rest. He moved with the confidence of someone who had grown up in this harsh landscape. Mary Beth struggled to keep up. Her soft ranch boots had been replaced with moccasins that felt strange on her feet. Every sound seemed loud enough to alert their pursuers. When she stepped on a dry branch that snapped with a sharp crack, Nalnish froze and listened for several long minutes before signaling that it was safe to continue. By dawn, they were deep in canyon country that Mary Beth had never seen before. Red rock walls rose hundreds of feet on both sides, creating a maze of passages that seemed to go on forever. The beauty was breathtaking but also terrifying. If something happened to Nalnish, she would never find her way out. As they rested in the shade of an overhanging cliff, Mary Beth finally had a chance to really look at her unlikely companion. Without his war paint, Nalnish looked younger than she had expected, maybe 35 or 40 years old. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and sorrow. His hands were scarred from years of hard living, but they moved with gentle precision when he prepared their simple meal of dried meat and water. She tried to imagine what his life had been like before the wars started. Had he been a peaceful man, a loving father? It was hard to reconcile the tender way he handled their meager supplies with the fierce warrior who had raided her ranch. "Children," she said softly, pointing toward herself and then in the direction they were traveling. It was one of the few English words he seemed to understand. Nalnish nodded and held up 2 fingers, then pointed to his own chest. His children. 2 of them, just like hers. Then he drew his finger across his throat and pointed toward the sky. Dead. Gone to the spirit world. Mary Beth felt tears sting her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He didn't understand the words, but he understood her tone. For a moment, the wall between their cultures disappeared completely. They were just 2 parents who had lost too much. Their moment of shared grief was interrupted by a sound that made both of them tense. Horses, still distant but definitely getting closer. Nalnish quickly packed their supplies and led Mary Beth deeper into the canyon system. What followed was the most terrifying day of Mary Beth's life. They climbed narrow ledges where one wrong step meant certain death. They crawled through passages so tight she could barely squeeze through. They crossed rushing streams where the water was so cold it took her breath away, but their pursuers were persistent. Sometimes she could hear voices echoing off the canyon walls. Once, they had to hide for 2 hours under an overhanging rock while a patrol road passed just 50 feet away. Mary Beth pressed her face against the stone and prayed they wouldn't be discovered. During their 3rd day of travel, disaster struck. They were crossing a particularly treacherous section of canyon when the sky suddenly darkened. Desert storms could appear without warning, and this one looked bad. The first drops of rain were deceptively gentle. But within minutes, the sky opened. Up and water poured down like someone had overturned a giant bucket. Mary Beth had heard about flash floods in canyon country, but she had never experienced one. The change was terrifying. The peaceful stream they had been following became a raging river in less than an hour. Water that had been ankle-deep suddenly reached their waists, then their chests. The current was so strong it threatened to sweep them away. Nalnish grabbed Mary Beth's hand and pulled her toward higher ground, but they weren't fast enough. A wall of muddy water came rushing down the canyon like a freight train. Mary Beth had time for one last breath before the flood hit them. The water tumbled her like a leaf in a windstorm. She couldn't tell which way was up. Her lungs burned as she fought to reach the surface. Just when she thought she was going to drown, strong hands grabbed her and pulled her toward a rocky ledge. Nalnish had somehow managed to catch her and drag them both to safety. They clung to the rocks, gasping and shivering while the flood raged below them. All their supplies were gone, swept away by the violent water. They spent that night huddled together for warmth, sharing body heat to survive the cold desert evening. Mary Beth had never been so close to an Apache warrior, and she was surprised to discover that he was just a man trying to survive. Like anyone else. As they waited for dawn, Nalnish began to speak in his own language. She couldn't understand the words, but she could hear the pain in his voice. He was telling her about his lost family, she realized, about his wife and children, about the attack that had destroyed his peaceful life. When he finished, Mary Beth told him about Daniel, about their happy years building the ranch, about the dreams they had shared. Neither understood the other's words, but somehow they understood each other perfectly. The flood had washed away more than their supplies. It had washed away the last barriers between them. They were no longer captor and captive, or even reluctant allies. They had become something rarer, 2 people from different worlds who had learned to trust each other completely. On the 4th day, they encountered their most dangerous threat yet. A mountain lion had been tracking them, probably drawn by the scent of their meager food supplies. Mary Beth first noticed the big cat when she saw its golden eyes watching them from a ridge above. Nalnish saw it too. He slowly reached for his knife, the only weapon they had left after losing everything in the flood. But Mary Beth could see the doubt in his eyes. A knife against a mountain lion was not good odds, especially when they were both weakened by Days of hard travel and little food. The standoff lasted for what felt like hours. The mountain lion followed them along the ridge, looking for the right moment to attack. Mary Beth's legs shook with exhaustion, but she forced herself to keep walking. Running would only trigger the cat's hunting instincts. Finally, Nalnish made his move. When they reached a narrow passage between two rocks, he positioned himself between Mary Beth and the mountain lion. He began making loud noises and waving his arms, trying to convince the big cat that he was more trouble than he was worth. The bluff worked. After several tense minutes, the mountain lion decided they weren't worth the effort and disappeared back into the rocks. But the encounter had taken its toll on both of them. They were running out of strength, and they still had no idea how much farther they had to travel. That evening, as they rested in another hidden canyon, Mary Beth asked the question that had been haunting her. "My children," she said, pointing. "Ahead. How far?" Nalnish held up one finger. "One more day, maybe two." They were close now, but Mary Beth wondered if they would have the strength to make it. The journey had pushed them both to their limits. As she fell asleep under the desert stars, Mary Beth realized that somewhere along this impossible journey, something had changed inside her. The world wasn't as simple as she had once believed. Good and evil weren't determined by the color of someone's skin or the language they spoke. Tomorrow they would reach their destination, and she would finally learn whether her children were safe. But whatever happened next, she knew she would never be the same person who had hidden in that root cellar just a week ago. The frontier had taught her its hardest lesson. Survival sometimes required trusting the very people you had been taught to fear. The hidden canyon appeared before them like a secret world carved into the heart of the mountains. Mary Beth had to blink several times to make sure she wasn't dreaming. After days of traveling through harsh desert landscape, this place seemed impossible. Green grass grew along a clear stream. Ancient trees provided shade from the blazing sun. And scattered throughout this paradise were Apache dwellings, not the temporary camps she had seen before, but a permanent settlement. Nalnish touched her arm and pointed toward a cluster of wickiups near the stream. Even from a distance, Mary Beth could see children playing in the water. Her heart began to race. Were Lucy and Ben among them? They approached carefully. Nalnish called out in Apache, announcing their arrival. An elderly man emerged from the largest dwelling and walked toward them. The conversation that followed was quick and urgent. Mary Beth couldn't understand the words, but she could read the concern on both men's faces. Then she heard it, a voice that made her knees weak with relief. "Mama?" Lucy stepped out from behind one of the wickiups, looking uncertain. She had grown darker from the sun, and her hair was braided in the Apache style, but she was unmistakably Mary Beth's daughter. Behind her came Ben, clutching a small wooden toy that one of the Apache children must have made for him. Mary Beth ran toward her children, tears streaming down her face. She dropped to her knees and pulled them into her arms, holding them so tightly they protested. They were alive. They were safe. For a moment, nothing else in the world mattered. But as she held them, she noticed something that broke her heart. In a different way. Lucy and Ben didn't seem entirely happy to see her. They looked back toward their Apache caregivers with something that looked like affection, even loyalty. "Mama, why did you take so long?" Ben asked in his 8-year-old voice. "Grandmother Ayana said you might never come?" Mary Beth looked up to see an Apache woman watching from nearby. This was clearly the grandmother Ayana Ben mentioned, not the same woman from Nalnish's camp, but someone who had taken on the role of caring for her children. The woman's expression was kind but sad, as if she knew this reunion meant losing. Children she had grown to love, Lucy pulled back from Mary Beth's embrace. "Mama, we have to say goodbye to our friends. And to grandmother, she taught me how to weave baskets and find medicine plants." The words hit Mary Beth like a physical blow. In the weeks since their capture, her children had built new relationships, learned new skills, adapted to a completely different way of life. They weren't the same frightened youngsters she remembered from that terrible morning at the ranch. Nalnish approached and spoke quietly to the elderly man, who Mary Beth now realized must be some kind of leader or medicine man. The conversation grew more intense, and other members of the community began to gather around them. A young Apache man who spoke some English came forward to translate. "Bad news comes from the east," he said gravely. "Army soldiers are gathering for big attack. Many soldiers, more than anyone has seen before. They plan to drive all Apache people from this land, kill anyone who resists." Mary Beth felt the blood drain from her face. "How long do we have? Maybe 2 days? Maybe 3. Scouts report soldiers are moving fast, bringing big guns." Nalnish turned to Mary Beth and spoke urgently. The translator continued. "Nalnish says he must warn his own people. They are camped 1 day's hard ride from here. If he leaves now, travels all night, maybe he can reach them in time." Mary Beth understood immediately. If Nalnish left to warn his people, he couldn't help her get Lucy and Ben to safety. But if he stayed to help her family, his own people, might be caught in the army's attack. "What about us?" she asked. "How do we get out of here?" The translator spoke to the elderly leader, then turned back to Mary Beth. "There is a path through the mountains that leads to Mexico. Very dangerous, but possible. Problem is, you need guide who knows the way. Without guide, you will be lost in wilderness." Mary Beth looked around the canyon at all the faces watching her. These people had cared for her children, protected them, treated them as family. Now they all faced destruction because of a war that seemed to have no end. An idea began forming in her mind. A crazy, dangerous idea that might save everyone or get them all killed. What if we all went together? She sighed. "Your people, my children, Nalnish's people, what if we all took the mountain path to Mexico?" The translator looked shocked. "You would do this? Leave your own country, live among Apache people?" Mary Beth thought about her burned ranch, her dead husband, the life that had been destroyed by hatred and violence. What did she really have left in the world of white settlements? Her children were the only thing that mattered now. "Tell them yes," she said firmly, "but I have one condition. Nalnish has to choose. He can't save everyone. Either he warns his people and lets us go alone, or he guides us to safety and trusts that his people will find their own way to escape." When the translator explained her proposal, a heated discussion broke out among the Apache leaders. Some thought the idea was impossible. Others argued it might be their only chance for survival. Nalnish stood apart from the group, clearly wrestling with the most difficult decision of his life. Mary Beth could see the pain in his eyes. He was being asked to choose between 2 groups of people he cared about. There was no right answer. Lucy tugged on Mary Beth's dress. "Mama, what's happening? Why does everyone look so worried?" Mary Beth knelt down to her daughter's level. "Sweetheart, we have to leave this place. There might be fighting here soon, and it's not safe." "But I don't want to leave," Lucy said, tears forming in her eyes. "This is my home now. These are my people." The words cut deep. Mary Beth realized her daughter was right. In the short time they had been here, Lucy and Ben had found something she couldn't give them. A sense of belonging to a community that valued them. Ben ran to the Apache woman who had been caring for them and wrapped his arms around her waist. "I don't want to leave, grandmother," he cried. Mary Beth watched her son cling to this woman who had shown him nothing but kindness. She thought about all the stories she had heard about savage Indians who supposedly had no feelings, no capacity for love or family bonds. Everything she had been taught was wrong. The elderly Apache leader approached Mary Beth and spoke through the translator. He says, "Your children are welcome to stay with us, become part of our people. Many white children have done this before. They grow up happy, learn our ways, become Apache in their hearts." Mary Beth felt dizzy. Stay with the Apache? Let her children grow up in a completely different culture? The idea terrified her, but she had to admit it also intrigued her. These people had shown her family more kindness in a few weeks than many white settlers had shown in years. Nalnish finally stepped forward and spoke to the group. His voice was heavy with emotion, but his decision was clear. The translator turned to Mary Beth. "He says he will guide everyone to Mexico. His own people are strong. They have survived many attacks before. But children need protection most. He chooses to save the children." Mary Beth felt a surge of gratitude toward this remarkable man who was willing to sacrifice everything for people who had once been his enemies, but their relief was short-lived. A young Apache scout came running into the canyon, shouting urgent warnings. The translator's face went pale. "Army found the main trail," he said quickly. "They are closer than we thought. Maybe one day, not 2 or 3. And there is more bad news." "What?" "Bidsy, the scarred one who wanted to claim you. He is leading soldiers to this canyon. He made deal with Army. Shows them secret paths in exchange for reward money." Mary Beth felt sick. The man who had wanted to sell her to Comanche raiders was now betraying his own people to the Army. Nalnish barked orders, and the entire canyon exploded into activity. This wasn't just about escaping anymore. This was about survival against impossible odds. With enemies approaching from multiple directions and time running out, Mary Beth gathered Lucy and Ben close to her. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. But she knew their greatest challenges still lay ahead. The impossible choice had been made. Now came the even more impossible task of staying alive long enough to reach safety. The morning sun cast long shadows across Devil's Canyon as 3 different groups converged on the narrow passage that would determine everyone's fate. Mary Beth held Lucy and Ben close to her as they crouched behind a wall of red rock, watching the drama unfold below them on the eastern ridge. She could see the blue uniforms of Army soldiers positioning themselves with military precision. Their leader was her brother-in-law, Captain James Mitchell, Daniel's younger brother who had sworn to find her after the ranch attack. She had hoped to see him again under better circumstances, not as an enemy across a battlefield. From the west came Bidsy and his followers, their faces painted for war. The scarred Apache leader had kept his promise to guide the soldiers, but Mary Beth could see the hatred in his eyes. This wasn't just about money anymore. This was about revenge against Nalnish for defying him, and scattered throughout the canyon were Nalnish's people, not just the warriors Mary Beth had expected, but entire families who had refused to abandon their leader. Old men, women with babies, children barely older than Lucy and Ben, they had come to fight for their right to exist in the land of their ancestors. Nalnish stood in the center of the canyon floor, looking impossibly calm despite being surrounded by enemies. He had positioned himself in the most dangerous spot, drawing attention away from the families hidden in the rocks above. Mary Beth knew she had to act. In minutes, this place would become a slaughter that would spare no one, not even the children. She had learned enough about frontier warfare to know that when shooting started in a confined space like this, bullets didn't care who they hit. She turned to the Apache woman who had been caring for Lucy and Ben. "Promise me," she whispered urgently. "If something happens to me, take my children and run. Don't let them see violence." The woman nodded solemnly and gathered both children into her arms. Despite their protests, Mary Beth stood up and began walking down the rocky slope toward the canyon floor. Behind her, she could hear gasps of surprise from both Apache and soldiers. A white woman in Apache clothing, walking calmly into the middle of a war zone, was not something anyone had expected. "James," she called out to her brother-in-law. "James." "Mitchell, it's me, Mary Beth." The captain lowered his spyglass and stared in disbelief. His sister-in-law, whom he had assumed was dead, was very much alive and apparently unharmed. "But why was she dressed like one of them?" "Mary Beth," James shouted back. "Stay where you are. We're here to rescue you." She kept walking until she stood beside Nalnish in the center of the canyon. The Apache leader looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. He knew what she was risking by exposing herself like this. "I don't need rescuing, James," Mary Beth called out, her voice echoing off the canyon walls. "I need you too. Listen to me, all of you." Bidsy snarled something in Apache and raised his rifle, but Nalnish spoke sharply to him. Even the scarred leader seemed curious about what this white woman had to say. Mary Beth took a deep breath. Everything depended on the next few minutes. "My husband is dead," she began, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "My ranch is burned. The life I knew is gone forever. But these people," she gestured toward the hidden Apache families, They saved my children when they could have left them to die. They treated us with kindness when they had every reason to hate us. She could see confusion on the soldiers' faces. This wasn't the story of savage captivity they had expected to hear. James, I know you love Daniel like a brother. I know you want justice for what happened to him. But killing these families won't bring him back. It will only create more orphans, more widows, more reasons for this war to continue. Captain Mitchell stepped forward, his face torn between duty and family loyalty. Mary Beth, these people are hostiles. They raided your ranch, killed Daniel. They're the enemy. Some of them are, Mary Beth agreed, looking directly at Bidsy, but not all of them. The man standing beside me risked everything to help me find my children. He could have traded me for weapons or horses, but instead he chose to protect me. She reached into the small pouch that the Apache women had given her and pulled out something that made everyone in the canyon freeze. It was a small turquoise pendant on a leather cord, the same pendant that Nalnish's daughter had been wearing. When she was killed by soldiers 3 years earlier, Nalnish had given it to Mary Beth the night before, telling her through gestures and the few English words he knew that she should give it to Lucy, a gift from one father to another's child, a symbol that love could survive even in the darkest times. This belonged to his daughter, Mary Beth said, holding the pendant high so everyone could see it. She was 8 years old when she died, the same age as my son Ben. She died in an army attack on a peaceful camp, killed while trying to hide behind her mother. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Bidsy lowered his weapon slightly, Mary Beth continued, her voice growing stronger. I propose an exchange. Not of prisoners or hostages, but of promises. I'll return to my own people, take my children back to civilization if that's what everyone wants. But these families get safe passage to Mexico. No pursuit, no revenge raids, no more killing. Captain Mitchell shook his head. Mary Beth, I can't make that kind of deal. I have orders to capture or eliminate all hostiles in this territory. Then you'll have to go through me first, Mary Beth said quietly. The words hung in the air like a challenge. A white woman threatening to fight against her own people to protect Apache families was unthinkable. But here she stood, clearly meaning every word. Nalnish spoke quietly to Mary Beth in the few English words he had learned during their journey together. You, good woman, children, safe now, you ... go home. Mary Beth looked into his weathered face and saw something that broke her heart. He was trying to release her from any obligation to his people. Even now, surrounded by enemies, he was thinking of her welfare above his own. No, she said firmly. We all go home together, or nobody goes home. What happened next surprised everyone. Old Apache women began emerging from their hiding places in the rocks, leading children by the hand. They walked slowly down to the canyon floor and stood beside Mary Beth and Nalnish. Then Apache warriors appeared, but they came without weapons raised. Instead, they positioned themselves protectively around the women and children. The message was clear. If the soldiers wanted to fight, they would have to kill families first. Captain Mitchell found himself facing an impossible situation. His orders were to eliminate hostiles, but these people weren't acting hostile. They were acting like families trying to protect each other. Bidsy, however, had no such moral conflicts. He raised his rifle and took aim at Nalnish, determined to end this standoff with violence. The shot that rang out across the canyon didn't come from Bidsy's rifle. Captain Mitchell had shot the weapon from the scarred leader's hands, unable to watch a man be murdered in cold blood. Stand down, Mitchell ordered his troops. All weapons down. The captain walked slowly toward Mary Beth, his face showing the internal struggle between duty and conscience. When he reached her, he spoke quietly so only she could hear. Daniel would be proud of you, he said. You found a way to honor his memory without perpetuating the cycle of violence that killed him. Mary Beth felt tears streaming down her face. Thank you, James. The agreement that followed wasn't perfect, but it was enough. The Apache families would have safe passage to the Mexican border. Mary Beth and her children would return to the settlement, where she would tell their story to anyone willing to. Listen, but before they parted ways, there was one more exchange to make. Nalnish approached Lucy and gently placed the turquoise pendant around her neck. Through Mary Beth, he told the little girl that it had belonged to someone very special, and that she should wear it to remember that people from different worlds could care for each other. Lucy touched the pendant and smiled at the Apache leader. "Tell him thank you," she said to her mother. "And tell him I'll never forget Grandmother Ayana and all the friends I made here." As the two groups prepared to go their separate ways, Mary Beth realized that her life had been forever changed by this experience. She was no longer the simple ranch wife who had hidden in a root cellar just weeks earlier. She had become a bridge between two worlds, carrying the stories and humanity of both. Years later, when Lucy grew up and had children of her own, she would still wear that turquoise pendant, and she would tell her grandchildren about the time. Her mother and an Apache warrior proved that enemies could become family, and that courage sometimes meant choosing understanding over revenge. The frontier had taught them all its most important lesson. Survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about staying human in the face of impossible choices. As Mary Beth walked away from Devil's Canyon with her children, she carried more than just memories. She carried the responsibility of telling a different kind of frontier story, one where heroes weren't defined by the color of their skin or the language they spoke, but by their willingness to choose compassion over hatred. The incredible escape was over, but the real journey, the journey toward understanding, was just beginning.